in general, the word assessment means to measure. For example, if they're coming over to assess your house, maybe they're coming over to check its value, to tax you all the better. But in general, assessment means measurement. But for our course, it's specifically gathering information to classify mental illness. So these would be the symptoms that would lead to a correct, hopefully, classification. Let's now consider two test considerations that are critical for accurate assessment. So no matter what the instrument, we have to consider, does it have test reliability and does it have test validity? Unless it has both, the instrument should not be used. Think of test reliability as in the word reliable. If something's reliable, it's consistent. Does the test give consistent results? So administer it one time. If you administer it in the near future, does it give highly consistent results? If it has test reliability, it will. Test validity refers to, does that test measure what it was designed to measure, what we say it measures? So if we call it a aptitude test, does it measure your academic aptitude or your ability to take a test for 6 hours and stay focused? Not necessarily the same thing. Another issue, another consideration that must be present, test standardization. So the test needs to be administered the same way each time it's administered. So if you take an SAT in Sacramento, California, New York City, or Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it will be administered the same way. Also part of standardization, it's been previously tested with a large group of people so we can interpret results. So maybe you're in the top 10% in an area, maybe even the top 5%. So we have to have it previously used so we can interpret the results. So next, consider the example at the bottom and decide what word you think should go into the blank. So our bathroom scale example concerns test reliability. So let's consider this real life but sad example that explores test reliability and test validity. Back almost 35 years ago, a sickly baby was taken to the doctor's office. The doctor examined her closely, came to a potential diagnosis, and then actually licked her forehead. That confirmed his diagnosis. Now he sent in for a standard test, but again, they supported his facial lick test. So first of all, what information was he searching for when he licked the baby's forehead? Next, let's assume that if this test was repeated in the future, it would always yield the same results. So, and again, he was using this particular test to measure a specific illness that you'll find out in the next listening icon. So what was he testing for? Do you know what condition she might have had? Does this test have test reliability? And did his test have test validity? So if you said testing temperature, no, he wouldn't have had to lick the baby to tell temperature. He was going for the taste. You might say a sweet baby. No, he wasn't looking for diabetes. He was looking for a salty baby, which very tragically, this baby was a very salty baby. He suspected the condition of cystic fibrosis. And when this baby grew up to be about the age of many of you in this class, she unfortunately perished from the condition. So did his test have test reliability? Yes, every time he would have licked the baby, he would have gotten the same taste. Did it have test validity? Did his test of licking the baby accurately measure the condition he thought it would? In other words, cystic fibrosis, and yes, it did. So although highly unusual, this doctor's test had both test reliability and test validity. So let's consider the major categories of assessment tools: that of clinical observation, clinical interviews, and clinical tests. But before we begin these particular discussion of tools, try to fill in the 4 blanks. As a hint, those blanks would correspond to the goals of abnormal psychology. Hopefully a very easy one for you at this point. So the first one, was it diagnose, define, describe? It would be describe. For example, describe the particular mental illness. Next one, you could either use the word explain or understand. For the third blank, either predict or prediction. And the fourth one, many answers would work. Control, modify, change are some of the best. So for clinical observation, you'd be observing both appearance as well as behaviors. Now, if the psychologist wants to do clinical observation, there are some choices that he, she, or maybe they prefer the pronoun they might choose. Let's consider these on our next slide. So let's look at some of the choices our clinician might choose between. Naturalistic observation in natural settings, such as maybe a school classroom, a playground, a workplace environment. Analog, non-natural environments, such as a laboratory situation. Or instead of having the clinician do the observation, we might have the client themselves gather data. So maybe they would record every time the information related to if they had a panic attack, what they were thinking and feeling before they lit up a cigarette, how many times they engaged in a certain behavior in the circumstance. So another way to get very useful information. There are many choices when it comes to how we set up self-monitoring. The clinician could use a beeper and randomly beep the person throughout the day and ask them to record data at that point. The person could do it every hour on the hour for certain points of the day. Or perhaps when they engage in certain behaviors, such as when they start eating, when they light up a cigarette, when they think a self-deprecating thought. So again, a very useful way to collect baseline data. So a mental health professional desiring to do a clinical interview has some choices. First choice level, structured or unstructured. Unstructured just means totally open-ended. There's no script. They can ask what they want, follow the questions and answers as they flow. Others choose to do a structured format, and structured has a very specific set of questions done in a very specific order. Could you blend the two? Why not? Let's focus on structured though. The gold standard, meaning it doesn't get any better, is the SCID version 5. Take a moment and see if you can figure out what the letters stand for. You just might be able to. So let's see how well you did in this guessing game. S, could it be for structured? Indeed it is. CI, well, do we have any CI on this page? Clinical interview. And for the D, well, for the first letter of DSM. So the DSM's structured interview is the gold standard. Now another commonly used one is the mini mental status exam, used when we're concerned about dementia, which is now referred to as cognitive dysfunction. The next slide, you'll actually be able to see the questions used in the mini mental status exam. Take a look at them and maybe try to do them on your own. If time allows, we'll do it in class together. The structured clinical interview of the DSM comes in two varieties, the CV and the PD. Take a moment and see if you can guess the C without peeking at the book cover, of course. Could it be clinical? Indeed it is. The PD, you would not be able to guess. That's specifically for the personality disorders. So apparently this SCID 5 comes in two versions, CV and PD. There you go. Next, let's consider the clinical tests. Neuroimaging, such as the EEG, CAT, or sometimes called CT scan, PET scan, MRI. It's quite possible that you or one of your classmates have had one or more of these. Neuropsychological. They look for cognitive impairment, in other words, brain damage. The Bender test is one that we'll do together in class if you're taking this as a live class. Intelligence tests, the most used would be the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler. Mental illness tests might be in the category of depression, anxiety, personality disorders, and more, but three of the most commonly used would be for these three disorder categories. The Beck and the Hamilton depression inventories, and for that matter, anxiety inventories, are by far the most commonly used. If you're reading a paper ever on a journal article on depression or anxiety, and they had to measure this illness in the subjects, they'll probably be using either the Beck or the Hamilton. And personality tests, you might have done some of these in Intro Psych. The Q-score, Myers-Briggs, NEOPI, MMPI, Rorschach, TAT, and sentence completion, amongst others. I'll give you the opportunity to take a couple of these for bonus points, should you care to and be inclined to do so. They're fun, and you'll learn hopefully a little bit about yourself. So let's consider neuroimaging, specifically the EEG. Take a moment and see if you can recall or know what each letter of EEG stands for, and then perhaps, do you know or could you guess two of the conditions an EEG is most commonly used to assess? So consider the letters and the conditions for a moment, and then go on to the answer. So the first E of EEG is for electro, as in the brain's electricity. The second E, encephalo, like maybe you've heard the condition encephalitis. Encephalo, or ceph, refers to head or brain. And then the G could be either graph or gram. I like graph to measure. So it tells you it's measuring, it's graphing the electricity of the head and brain. To have it done, the electrodes could be put on individually as shown on the left, or kind of like in a bathing cap array as shown on the right. Why is it used? Two of the most common reasons would be to help diagnose sleep disorders and also to help diagnose epilepsy. Let's consider the CT or CAT scan. The device is shown on the bottom that you would lay on and be slid a little bit into. If you're unlucky, you might need to have a dye, either oral and or injected or IV. If you're lucky, you don't need any dyes. The image is created with a computer, hence the C. It looks rather like an X-ray, but can easily be colorized, by the computer, such as the picture on the left. And I'm sure many of you had CT, whether it's a head issue, a back issue, a neck issue, and so on. And you think, oh, I've had it, that was very noisy. No, if it's very noisy, it wouldn't have been the CAT scan you had. We'll see what you would have had if it's very noisy. And a slide or two. But next, a couple slides on CAT scan humor. So here's a test to determine if you're a House fan. So if House looked at the slide, what would House say about the Cats comment. So invariably, when one of House's team said, maybe the condition is lupus, House invariably said, it's never lupus. So correct answer, it's never lupus. Let's now consider the neuroimaging technique of the PET scan. PET is by far a less commonly used tool, although it is available locally. I've never had a student know somebody that had a PET scan used on them. It's often used in research or cancer detection. The person is given an IV of radioactive glucose. The body burns this radioactive fuel. The body becomes radioactive, and it's detected by the imaging device. Let's consider the neuroimaging technique called the MRI. I don't care if you know what the R and I stand for, and it wouldn't be radio, by the way, though good guess. It's resonance imaging. I would like you to know the M for magnetic. So a lot of times students aren't sure if they've had a CAT scan or an MRI. The MRI is very loud. They'll typically offer you headphones and or a radio station to listen to. A lot of clanking and clunking, very, very loud. You may or may not need a dye depending on what they're looking at. You put in the device. A quick one might be a few minutes. A long one might be well over an hour. Of course, with any picture, whether it's a cat or a pet, you can't move while it's active. They'll give you little breaks so that you're allowed to move. And it will create a very high quality picture. MRI, much more costly than the CAT scan option. And it's a nice tool to have available. Obviously, using a magnetic field, they're concerned about any sort of thing that might be metal in your body, whether it's an implanted decorative stud or maybe a prison tattoo that might use metal in the paint. That can be quite problematic or make you not a candidate for this particular tool. So with that, we'll move on to our next slide. In class, I always give students a share about their experiences with MRIs and CAT scans and PET scans, if any, but we'll have to see how you're taking this course, I guess. So we mentioned some of the most commonly used methods of diagnosis, DDX. Now let's consider some of the high-tech treatments available, starting with VNS, in other words, vagus nerve stimulation. This is an uncommon treatment. It's a fallback position for depression and epilepsy. The electrical supply, the battery, is often implanted underneath the collarbone. Wiring under the skin leads to the vagus nerve into the neck, and it gives it gentle pulses. And these gentle pulses will help to diminish depression or to extremely decrease the prevalence of the epileptic seizures. So not a common treatment, but good for those people who are in need. DBS is another one of the newer stimulation techniques. It stands for deep brain stimulation. It's just a little over 20 years old. It's used to treat various things. The FDA has approved for Parkinson's treatment, depression, and chronic pain. It is not a common treatment. I have never come across anybody personally who's had it. A friend of a friend just had the first of 2 surgeries a couple days ago. The battery is implanted under the collarbone or apparently in the armpit. Wiring will lead to the battery underneath the skin, underneath the scalp, to an electrode that's been implanted in the brain, and there will be gentle stimulation, which might diminish Parkinson's symptoms or depression, or help the person with chronic pain. Again, not at all common, but for those people who need it, it will be a lifesaver. Let's consider TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. The person's put into a very strong magnetic field, which is very specific. It's a very limited area, and it's got to be very close to the surface of the brain. This is a newer technology, just over 10 years old. It is FDA approved for a few purposes, and as time passes, I'm sure we'll see more. It's used to treat depression, Parkinson's, migraines, and tinnitus. So keep in the back of your mind if you know somebody that suffers from migraines or severe ear ringing, or perhaps you'll develop an issue. It's not remotely a comfortable procedure. I read an author who just compared it to having a jackhammer put onto your skull. Not pleasant. Clearly this woman has a slight smile. She is not getting TMS. But it can make all the difference in the world for some people. It's a fallback position, and perhaps in the future it'll be less uncomfortable. But for those who need it, it could be life-saving. Your textbook prefers the term neuropsychological tests, which sounds a little vague. We'll call it tests for cognitive dysfunction, or cut to the chase, we're talking about brain damage. So consider the Bender test shown. We'll do it together for in class. You're supposed to just by hand copy the images 1 through 9. The right would be a possible response for a person with brain damage, noticing the rounding of the edges, the loss of angle on number 4, the loss of perspective on many of the images. So a response such as one shown would be exactly what you would not want to see. Let's now briefly consider intelligence tests, commonly called IQ tests. These tests measure both verbal and nonverbal, sometimes called performance intelligence. 2 tests are primarily used: the Wechsler, which has 3 versions, 2 for different age children and 1 for adults, and the Stanford-Binet, used on only 1 version, used on individuals aged 2 and higher. Basically, you would do the questions until a certain number of questions could not be successfully answered. It'd be a fairly quick test on a 2-year-old, obviously. There are numerous mental illness tests for practitioners to choose from, and there are obviously more disorders than listed on this particular slide, but these are some of the very most commonly used. So depression, we had mentioned the inventory and scale before. For anxiety, we had also mentioned this inventory and scale before, and also the same for personality disorders. So take a moment and see if you can remember what should go in the blanks. If not, go ahead and peek at a previous slide. This will be a good learning testing moment. So for depression, the Beck Depression Inventory and the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale are the most used. For anxiety, similarly, the Beck Anxiety Inventory or the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And for personality, the Structured Clinical Interview for the DSM for personality disorders. So hopefully this was easy. If not, just spend a moment studying it, and it'll help you in the long run, and would be great preparation for upcoming tests and perhaps even quizzes. If you're curious to see what the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale looks like, I've included in this slide. No, you don't have to know the specific items. I just would like you to know that it is the most commonly used anxiety scale. If we're talking about the Hamilton Anxiety, the Hamilton Depression is the most used, even more than Beck, of the depression scales. And if you walk away with that, that's what I'd like you to know about this particular slide. But again, I look at the items. I thought you might find them useful. Since we took a peek at the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, I thought it might be useful if you were to look at an anxiety inventory to use the Beck. No, you don't have to recognize, you don't have to memorize the particular categories. Just look it over to just give a feel of it, and that's really my only goal for concluding this slide. So hopefully it's a low anxiety experience for you. Let's now consider the Q-sort, a humanistic developed technique. Take a moment and see if you can remember our two major humanistic psychologists. So perhaps the name Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow came to mind. If so, excellent. Now this technique can be done in various ways. The person will be given a pile of words and concepts and has to sort them. And the criteria for sorting would depend on what the therapist was trying to achieve. Maybe sort them into a pile that describes you well and does not describe you. Maybe then take the pile that does not describe you. What things in that pile do you wish describe you? That might lend itself towards self-actualization. Which things in the list that describe you do you find upsetting or would you like to change? Again, maybe it would help with self-actualization or the presenting problem. So the criteria the therapists use to sort is up to them, but it's a useful technique. The Myers-Briggs is useful for learning about the personality style or type. It's 4 different dimensions, and each one has two different ends. You may have taken this for a different class, perhaps, maybe sociology in groups or other human services classes. If you still have the results and would like to get a small bonus, send them to me in a link, or if you've never taken one but are interested, go ahead, click the link, and save a treat. Just if you want to give me a paper version, which I really don't prefer, just print the summary page. If you're sending it, I don't need the entire thing. Just send me the summary page. I think you might find it an enjoyable activity and it would allow you to learn a little bit about yourself. Given the different combinations of extroverted versus introverted, sensing versus intuitive, thinking versus feeling, judging versus perceiving, there are 16 different personality styles. And no, I won't be quizzing you to see if you understand which each letter stands for, so if you're worried. But again, it might be interesting to learn your type and the implications of being that type. Now let's next consider a very commonly used assessment inventory, the MMPI. I would like you to know what the P and the I stand for, which would be personality inventory. I'm rather indifferent if you know the M and the M, Minnesota multiphasic. But again, I would like you to know the PI part of it. It measures personalities and also suggests how you stand in terms of certain mental illnesses. There are a total of 567 questions to respond to. True, false, or sometimes they'll include true, false, and cannot say. So again, it suggests where you stand on both personality and mental illness. For example, if your pattern of answers is very similar to a depressed person, then you're likely to have depression. If your pattern of answers suggests schizophrenia, it might suggest that you are actively schizophrenic. Or if your pattern of answers suggests that you have antisocial personality disorder, well, then you are a sociopath in the vernacular. So a commonly used and very useful instrument. As you can see, the MMPI assesses where you stand on 10 specific scales. So I include the slide just in case you're curious. And no, you won't be tested or quizzed on what these 10 different dimensions are. But still, you might enjoy reading it and see what each word corresponds to. It'll increase your understanding of psychology and in some areas, perhaps vocabulary in general. So do take a peek. When you did the personality chapter back in Intro Psych, hopefully you covered the big 5 personality traits. The big 5 are the personality traits that are considered to be foundational, essential, core. You might have learned the mnemonic ocean, helping you remember each letter. O would be for openness to new experiences. C in ocean for conscientiousness. Dependability and similarity in terms of other ideas and concepts. E, extroversion-introversion. A, agreeableness. And N, neuroticism, or in other words, emotional stability. So the NEOPI measures all 5 traits, though it does emphasize the N, the E, and the O. I've included a link, so if you'd like to see where you stand on these 5 personality traits, by all means go ahead and take it. If you have taken it before and you still have access to the summary sheet, definitely send it to me for a little bit of extra credit. Again, it's fun and interesting learning about oneself, and there's really no bad results from this. It's just your particular standing on these 5 dimensions. Another option for our mental health professional would be to administer a projective personality test. These tests show ambiguous material that can be interpreted and answered in many different ways. It allows them to project themselves, if you will, into the question's answer, unlike maybe an MMPI that you have to answer true or false, or perhaps cannot say to. Sentence completion, shown on the right. So these can be constructed by the therapist quite easily, or you can go with SAC's more standard version. It tells the therapist what the person might be concerned about, what they hope to achieve. Very useful. Draw a person test works particularly well on nonverbal people, such as young children. TAT. In Intro Psych, I tell my students to pretend it stands for tell a tale. It does not. We'll learn later on what it does stand for, and the famous Rorschach. Let's start with the most famous of the projective personality tests, that of the inkblot test. Do you know its formal name? If you're thinking Rorschach, indeed, you're correct. Look at the image and see what different images you can see. On the next icon, I'll give you some of the common interpretations my students see. Many students see the gray on top as being 2 crabs battling. The blue images below also looks something like sea life. The blue in the center might look like a bathing suit, at least the top of a woman's bathing suit. The green below it might look like a mustache, and the eyes of the mustache figure. The red might be like large arms on a figure, or 2 seahorses, and so on. So typically people can see many, many images, and so the clinician would write down all the images and then go to the scoring manual. Unfortunately, this is, if you talk about reliability and validity, this is not a particularly desirable test, to say the least. Many psychologists of all ilks question whether it truly measures personality. The originator of the inkblot test loved making inkblots as a hobby. What would we have if he was a crocheter or a knitter? So again, virtually always there's a better personality test that could be used. We just mentioned this one for historical reasons primarily. For our next projective test, let's consider the TAT. Now, I tell my students in intro to pretend it stands for tell a tale. It does not. It actually stands for thematic apperception test. Do you need to know that? No. So it's an ambiguous picture, and you're asked to tell a tale. So look at this picture and think of a few stories that it suggests. If you're curious, you can click the next icon to see what other people see in it. I love the TAT because virtually every year I hear a new interpretation of this test. Common ones include a evil witch and pursuing the youth story. Maybe a person considering being a nun and the nun in the background. A eavesdropping, nosy neighbor, and a person in the foreground. A zombie trying to get the brains of the youth. That's a new one. Stalker and stalker and a stalky. That's a newer one. A ghost pursuing the older person. A grandmother or a mother very concerned about the young person. A person thinking about their old age, or a person in old age thinking about youth. There's so many interpretations. So again, the diagnostician would write down the tales and go to a scoring manual. Again, I think this is a very interesting test because it allows you to tell your life experiences, your interpretations. So one story not so important, but you'll be given a collection of stories, and for each one you'll have to images, and for each one you'll have to tell a story. So collectively we'll learn about how you view people, relationships, outcomes, life events. So it really does tell a lot about you. So a very good test. So we've just completed our coverage of assessment, the ways we gather data to allow us to perform a diagnosis. Now you might remember that there were 3 major ways of assessment. Take a moment and see if you can remember without peeking the 3 major categories. If you can't, go ahead and peek. But this should be basically foundational knowledge for this chapter because all the methods we talked about revolved around those 3 assessment techniques. So our 3 primary methods of assessment would be observation, clinical interviews, and what we just completed, clinical tests. So one of the primary methods of diagnosis by mental health professionals would be the DSM, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. You'll see from the cover that the current version is 5. That was printed back in 2013. It was just revised the current year, at least in terms of where I'm doing this narration, that would be 2022. And it's not a full revision, it's a mild, well-controlled revision that's called the TR. You can see the new cover below. It's attractive metal, and it actually has some color in terms of use of it now, so it's nicer to use. Anyway, so the current version is DSM-5 TR, which stands for Text Revision. As you can see, it was published by the APA, but what does the APA stand for? Many students on a test tell me it's the American Psychological Association. Makes sense, but no, that would not be correct. As you can see, probably in the original DSM-5, it's published by the American Psychiatric Association. All good test questions and quiz questions, by the way. In the newest DSM, the text revision version, the codes are based on the ICD-10, which stands for the International Classification of Diseases. The ICD-10 is authored by WHO, in other words, the World Health Organization. It's a parallel diagnostic system to the DSM. It's important because its codes are required for insurance companies. So if the mental health practitioner wants to get reimbursed and accept patients that have insurance, although they will probably use the DSM, they will use the corresponding codes in the ICD-10. A little bit convoluted, but that's the way it is. Let's now consider some of the changes associated with the newest version of the DSM, that of the DSM-5-TR, TR being for text revision. These changes are based on 10 years of scientific literature, so not done on whim by any sense of the imagination. The changes were not sufficient for a full revision, hence the term text revision. Compared to the DSM-5, it's got a bigger introduction, a bigger use of manual section, just one new disorder, that of prolonged grief disorder, an increased recognition and focus on racism and discrimination, New terms for gender dysphoria. For example, natal, in other words, birth sex, is now changed to individual assigned either male or female at birth, depending on which. Medical procedures are now termed gender-affirming medical procedures. There have been code updates. Only the ICD codes are now used, and there are two new conditions that have codes. Suicidal behavior is new to the DSM, independent of other diagnoses, and non-suicidal self-injury. Let's now consider some of the changes associated with the newest version of the DSM, that of the DSM-5-TR, TR being for text revision. These changes are based on 10 years of scientific literature, so not done on whim by any sense of the imagination. The changes were not sufficient for a full revision, hence the term text revision. Compared to the DSM-5, it's got a bigger introduction, a bigger use of manual section, just one new disorder, that of prolonged grief disorder, an increased recognition and focus on racism and discrimination. New terms for gender dysphoria. For example, natal, in other words, birth sex, is now changed to individual assigned either male or female at birth, depending on which. Medical procedures are now termed gender-affirming medical procedures. There have been code updates. Only the ICD codes are now used, and there are two new conditions that have codes. Suicidal behavior is new to the DSM, independent of other diagnoses, and non-suicidal self-injury. Now let's consider basic DSM features. I haven't listed every single feature. I thought that might be overwhelming. Others will be noted as we look at a particular disorder and throughout the course. Versus the diagnostic criteria, new to the DSM-TR, is use of color for these. And it's menu-ish. I think of it maybe a Chinese menu. Pick one disorder from category 2 and at least two choices from category 3. So it lays it out in a, as I said, a menu-ish fashion. Diagnostic features, they're termed for essential features, the features that must be there for the diagnoses. If they're not there, you cannot diagnose the individual with this particular disorder. Associated features, these are common features, often there but not required. Prevalence, in other words, how common the disorder is. New to DSM-5, dimensional information. Does the individual have a mild, moderate, or severe case of disorder? Differential diagnosis, to help you distinguish it from disorders that might present some similar symptoms. Functional consequences, in other words, how it will affect their day-to-day life. Often, but not always, listed as comorbidity, disorders which frequently co-occur with a disorder, and suicide risk, again, not listed in disorders in which there is minimal suicide risk. Now let's consider basic DSM features. I haven't listed every single feature. I thought that might be overwhelming. Others will be noted as we look at a particular disorder and throughout the course. Versus the diagnostic criteria, new to the DSM-TR, is use of color for these. And it's menu-ish. I think of it maybe a Chinese menu. Pick one disorder from category 2 and at least two choices from category 3. So it lays it out in a, as I said, a menu-ish fashion. Diagnostic features, they're termed for essential features, the features that must be there for the diagnoses. If they're not there, you cannot diagnose the individual with this particular disorder. Associated features, these are common features, often there but not required. Prevalence, in other words, how common the disorder is. New to DSM-5, dimensional information. Does the individual have a mild, moderate, or severe case of disorder? Differential diagnosis, to help you distinguish it from disorders that might present some similar symptoms. Functional consequences, in other words, how it will affect their day-to-day life. often but not always listed as comorbidity, disorders which frequently co-occur with the disorder, and suicide risk, again, not listed in disorders in which there is minimal suicide risk. So we've now considered assessment and diagnosis, but I thought it might be helpful if we put it all together and noted the basic typical steps that would go into having the first session with a new client. So the mental health professional will immediately try to establish rapport, a connection, a meaningful relationship with their new client. They will explain and then obtain informed consent, including touching on confidentiality, the exceptions, HIPAA, and their particular policies that they have as a practitioner. Determine what the presenting problem or problems are. Get an overview of their life problems. Diagnose. Assess any risk of suicidality. Obtain a social, medical, and mental health history. Share their diagnosis and the treatment plan, and then end the session. So these would be the typical events occurring in the first meeting with a mental health practitioner. Now you might have noticed that the very first step to putting all together the meeting with the client in the first session is establishing rapport. And part of that is establishing a therapeutic alliance. Think of it as a working partnership between the mental health practitioner and the client. So it's not like dropping your car off to an automotive repair mechanic and you really don't care so much the details, you just want it fixed. In therapy, you are actually part of the process. You are an active participant, and success would be impossible without this effort on your part, this alliance, this working partnership. So go ahead and after you've studied this particular content, assess yourself, and if you have any trouble, do it again until you have success. And if you score perfectly, be sure to review it before the test. That is essential. So let's see how you did. Bender test, neuropsychological, though we said cognitive impairment is easier to remember, and that's fine for us. The Rorschach TAT, MMPI, Myers-Briggs, sentence completion, well, they would be personality tests, some of the objective variety and some of the projective. EEG, CAT or CT scan, PET scan, MRI would all be neuroimaging, and inventories such as the Beck Depression Inventory or the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, definitely tests of mental illness. Again, don't forget to review these before the test. It'll definitely be so helpful for you. It'll help you to get to the goal that you are seeking to get. So let's explore the concepts of the previous slide, but in more depth. So for each of these tests, please indicate if the personality test, an intelligence test, a neuroimaging test, or a cognitive impairment test. So the Q sort, a humanistic personality test, so P, EEG, neuroimaging, and I. TAT, another personality test, so P. Stanford-Binet, intelligence test, so an I. CAT or CT scan, an I. Wechsler, I. PET scan, neuroimaging, an I. The Myers-Briggs and the NEOPI, as the P and the PI would suggest, both P's, personality tests. The MMPI, again as the P would suggest, personality. Bender test, cognitive impairment. The MRI and NI, Rorschach, P. And sentence completion, P. So if you did great, terrific. If not, study the ones you got wrong and do it again. And do it again till you can do it easily. And don't forget to review at least one time immediately before you take the test on this particular chapter. So after you finish studying this particular chapter, here's some basic terms you should be able to answer. I really don't expect you'll be able to answer all of these. Certainly some will give you trouble. So after you take it, listen to the answers, work on those that gave you trouble, study them, take those specific ones again, and then just keep repeating to you. It's second nature to you. And once you're doing well, again, don't forget to study it. Leave sufficient time prior to the first test and the test or whatever test it's on. It will help you immensely in getting to the goal that you're searching for. So ICD, International Classification of Diseases. DSM, our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. WHO, World Health Organization. Our term for the test's consistency, that's test reliability. Our term for the test measuring what it says it does. That one was test validity. Who publishes the DSM? The APA, but what does APA stand for? It stands for two different things. The publisher of the DSM is not the American Psychological Association, but is the American Psychiatric Association. ICD, published by the WHO, World Health Organization. 3 basic ways to collect assessment data. Well, observation, personality tests, we can call them clinical tests, which include personality tests and other tests. So observation, clinical tests, and clinical interviews. Current version of the DSM, DSM-5-TR for text revision. Years published, well, 2022. Name 3 personality tests, quite a few to choose from. The NEOPI, MMPI, the TAT, the historical but pretty useless Rorschach tests, a sentence completion, draw a picture, as well as many others. Name 1 IQ test. Perhaps you went with the Stanford-Binet, or perhaps you went with the Wechsler, with no X in the spelling. Name 2 neuroimaging tests. Maybe you've had an imaging test, or even 2. PET scan, probably not, but perhaps a CT scan, also known as a CAT scan. Maybe the MRI, or maybe the older and simpler and not truly neuroimaging, but anyway, we put in the category the EEG, the electroencephalograph. So this will be a harder slide, so don't be afraid to keep studying it and testing yourself and studying and testing yourself until you really get a strong grasp of it. It's important for your understanding of the course and also for the tests. And I'm sure you could do it, but again, you'll have to keep plugging, so don't be afraid. It's not you, it is hard material, but ever so critical for our course. So used to tell the disorder from similar disorders, that would be differential diagnosis. The common features of the disorder, that would be the diagnostic features. How common the disorder is, that would be prevalence. Co-occurring disorders, that would be comorbidity. Whether the disorder is mild, moderate, severe, that's the dimensional information. Essential features, the ones that have got to be there, that is the diagnostic features. How it affects their life, that would be functional consequences. the menüish part, which is now in color, thank you, APA, that would be the diagnostic criteria and risk of suicide. Well, that's suicide risk. So again, don't be afraid to do this over and over, and once you master it, still make sure you do it a couple times immediately prior to taking the test.